Today we'll be finishing up our teaching on exegesis, which is step 1 in the 10 translation steps. In the first teaching on exegesis, we had an overview and learned that it means to understand a source text. In the second teaching, we identified good questions to ask so that we can do research in order to be able to understand the source text. And in today's third session, we will be looking at finding answers to those questions. So in review, remember there are two main tasks in doing exegesis before you start to translate. The first is to ask good questions, and the second to find the answers. After you've finished identifying questions in the text that need further study, it's time to find the answers. And remember, especially in the early stages of a translation project, it's helpful to use the form we handed out for doing research. In the first column, you've already written some exegetical questions for each verse. In the second column, you can write answers to those questions as you do research and find the answers. And then in the third column, you can note down any ways to draft those issues. Now let's review how we're going to go about finding answers to our questions. The first way is to compare the text in various versions. So in English, other national languages where you work, other languages which you read, or back translations in other related languages in your area. Remember to always compare both literal and meaning-based versions. Meaning-based versions often can help clarify what a literal version is saying. The text of the Bible is your most reliable help. Look also in translation reference materials. For instance, Translator's Notes and Translator's Handbook, which are both in Paratext. For me, these are two extremely valuable tools. There have been many commentaries written on the Bible to help us understand the source text, but Translator's Notes and Translator's Handbook do that as well. And then they also help give us ideas about how we can translate those difficult things into our languages. And then there are exegetical summaries and other commentaries on Translator's Workplace. If the meaning of a word isn't clear, look it up in a dictionary. For some languages, there are flex dictionaries or online dictionaries or dictionary apps. Now, if the question has to do with Jewish culture or religion, then look it up in a Bible dictionary. Or you can use Google. But remember, be careful with the answers you receive back from Google. And lastly, use people as resources for difficult problems. You can ask a pastor or friend with good Bible knowledge. Other translators in your area who have already worked through that passage. They will be a valuable source of help because they have already researched and struggled with how to say those things in a related language to yours. And you can always ask for help from your consultant. So let's look at the questions we've identified so far that need further research. After comparing verses in the previous presentation, we had the following questions. And you would have these written down in the first column on your form for each verse. Chapter 11, verse 2. We decided that there would be a potential difference in meaning between name and holy name. So which one should we translate in our translation? In verse 3, there was a difference in meaning between bread and food. So once again, which one should we translate? In verse 4a, is indebted the same as do us no wrong? And in the last part of verse 4, there's a difference between temptation and hard times. So which one is right? Which one should we translate in our translation? Well, let's look at each of these. In Luke 11:2, RSV says, when you pray, say, Father, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. GNT says, when you pray, say this, Father, may your holy name be honored, may your kingdom come. So there's a difference in meaning between name and holy name. Which one's right? Which should we translate? Well, the first thing we need to do is to compare different versions. At the top are 3 versions you can read and compare the text there. The next English version, GNT, says, may your holy name be honored. So they use the word holy. In LT, says, may your name be kept holy. The next one, CEV, says, Father, help us to honor your name. Now, that version does not use the word holy, just to honor your name. NIV says, hallowed be your name. Once again, the word holy is not there, but this word hallowed is. The NET version says, Father, may your name be honored. So holy is not there. And then ESV, hallowed be your name. Once again, holy is not there, but the word hallowed is. So just by comparing that question in various versions, the answer isn't real clear. So let's look at some different reference tools. In the Greek interlinear, we see the word hagiastheto, which is glossed as revere. Translator's Notes explains that a bit. Hallowed be your name. The Greek clause that the NIV translates as hallowed be your name is a prayer. It is a prayer that God would cause his name to be recognized or honored as holy. Translator's Handbook says to hallow, or to acknowledge, revere, or honor as holy. The Analytical Greek Lexicon says when this word is used of God's and Christ's name, treat as holy, revere. So from the translation reference tools, we are getting the idea that this word is closely linked with the idea of holiness. So in conclusion, I would say that both are possible, either to have name or holy name. But including the idea of holy would be better. GNT said, may your holy name be honored. Now that is in passive voice, be honored. In active voice, as Translator's Notes display suggests, you could say, may people honor or revere your holy name. Or may people honor you because you are holy. There they have replaced the name with the person of God, which here is acceptable. May people honor you because you are holy. Let's go on to the next question we wrote in verse 3. RSV says, give us each day our daily bread. GNT says, give us day by day the food we need. So that is a difference in meaning, and which will we use in our translation? Once again, let's compare this issue in various versions. So here at the top are 3 versions, and you can read those or read a national language version if you're working in another country. Next is GNT, which says, give us day by day the food we need. NLT, give us each day the food we need. CEV, give us each day the food we need. So these three versions are meaning-based versions, and they've all translated with food. NIV says, "Give us each day our daily bread." NET says the same thing with bread. And also ESV, the same with bread. So those three versions are more literal versions, and they all use bread. Now this can give us a clue, because meaning-based versions are trying to make clear and natural a text for our target audience. Let's go on and look at some other translation reference tools. Translator's Handbook has a note on our daily bread. It says, "the bread or food we need for this day." Well, that doesn't really help answer our question. So let's look at Translator's notes. There, for bread, it says, "For the Jewish people of Jesus' time, bread was the most important food." In this context, the word bread represents food in general. If people in your area will not understand a literal translation of bread in this way, you may translate bread more generically as food. So there we really find the answer to our question. Bread was the staple for the Jewish people. In saying, "Give us this day our daily bread," it is really talking about give us the food we need in order to survive and live. So if bread is not the main staple in what your people eat, and it's often not, then it may be better to replace that specific term bread that was used in the Jewish culture with a more general term like food, so that it clearly translates the meaning for our target audience today. Now let's look at our first question in verse 4. RSV says, "For we ourselves forgive everyone who is indebted to us." GNT says, "For we forgive everyone who does us wrong." So it's a good question. Is indebted to us the same meaning as people who do us wrong, or a different meaning? Is Jesus just telling us to forgive those who owe us money, or to forgive those who do wrong things against us? The first thing we need to do is compare this in different versions. So once again, we have the three Nepali versions at top, and you can read those, or read in a national language version in your country. GNT says, "Forgive us our sins, for we forgive everyone who does us wrong." NLT says, "As we forgive those who sin against us." CEV says, "As we forgive everyone who has done wrong to us." NIV says, "For we also forgive everyone who sins against us." NET says the same, "For we also forgive everyone who sins against us." ESV says, "For we ourselves forgive everyone who is indebted to us." So there we see that it is only the most literal version, ESV, which has used the word indebted. And that can give us a clue. The literal version has translated the form of the Greek word. The other versions may have tried to clarify the meaning of that word. Let's go on and take a look at different translation reference tools to see what that word indebted might mean. If we look at this word in a dictionary, we see that the main definition of the word indebted is owing money. Translator's Handbook has a note saying, "Where words associated with debt cannot be used figuratively, one may shift to who is guilty toward us, who does us evil, or who has offended us." And then in Translator's Notes display, we see that they have translated this with, "For we also forgive everyone who does us wrong," or "because we ourselves pardon all those who act wrongly toward us." So in conclusion, there is no real difference in meaning between these versions. They are not proposing two different interpretations of the text. Instead, it's a question of clarity, since that literal term indebted, which was used figuratively in Greek, can actually give us a wrong meaning today. Jesus wasn't telling us to ask God to forgive us our sin as we forgive those who owe us money, but to forgive us our sin as we forgive those who sin against us or who have done us wrong. So we now have our last question that we identified that we need to do further research on in order to understand the meaning of the source text. In the second part of verse 4, RSV says, "And lead us not into temptation." G&T says, "And do not bring us to hard testing." So are these just different ways of saying the same thing? Or is there a difference in meaning here? And if so, which should we follow in our translations? So once again, the first thing we do is to compare the issue in various versions. Once again, 3 versions at the top. Then G&T says, "And do not bring us to hard testing." NLT, "Don't let us yield to temptation." CEV, "Keep us from being tempted." NIV, "Lead us not into temptation." NET says the same, "Do not lead us into temptation." And also ESV the same with temptation. So we see that only one of the versions, G&T, used hard testing. All the other versions had temptation. Now let's look at some translation reference tools to see if they talk about this issue. In Translator's Notes, we immediately see there are 2 points showing 2 interpretations. Let's read the note. The Greek word that the NIV translates here as temptation is ambiguous. There are 2 ways to interpret this word. First, it means temptation. This refers to being tempted to sin. For example, one version says, "Don't allow us to be tempted," and it lists a number of other versions that support that interpretation. Second, it means testing. This refers to difficulties and persecutions. For example, TEV says, "Do not bring us to hard testing," and it lists several other versions that support that interpretation. And then, as Translator's Notes always does, it says, "It is recommended you follow interpretation 1, along with the majority of Bible scholars." The note goes on to say, "Lead us not into temptation." The clause means that we should ask God to lead or guide our lives away from situations that expose us to temptation. It is a request that God will protect us from situations where someone or something will persuade us to sin. God himself does not tempt people. So we can see how very helpful Translator's Notes is in addressing our question and showing us that there actually are 2 different ways to understand that word. Translator's Notes display then gives us some options of possible ways to translate it. The first, "And do not allow us to be tempted to sin." Next, "Please keep or protect us from being tempted to sin." And then the third one gives an option for how to translate it not using the word tempted, in case you don't have that in your language. "And please help us so that nothing or nobody will persuade or cause us to sin. So in conclusion, for this question, we did discover that there was actually a difference in meaning between the versions. There were two different interpretations. And the reference materials, in this case following the majority of versions, help guide us to the recommended interpretation. So it's not, do not lead us into hard testing, but it should be, do not lead us into temptation. So in doing exegesis, we said we need to come up with questions to see if texts in different versions have different meanings or if they are just different ways of saying the same thing. And then we also said we need to look at the meaning of key terms. So yesterday we identified in the first 4 verses of Luke 11 some theologically significant terms, or key terms, that might require more research. And here are those words. Now, hallowed, bread, and temptation, we've just gone over. And later in this workshop, we will have a class teaching on key terms and go over the terms Lord and kingdom. So right now, let's just take a deeper look at this word sin to make sure that we really understand the meaning of this word in the source text. In researching the term sin, one place you could look would be in a dictionary. There we see a definition. Sin is an immoral act considered to be a transgression against divine law. Another place you might look for information would be in a Bible dictionary. Here I have pasted in a explanation from one Bible dictionary. As you can see, it's quite long. We're not going to read it, but I wanted to show it to you so that you know the kind of place you can go to find information on key terms. Another very clear and helpful resource for finding out the meaning of key terms is Translator's Notes. And often it is the first occurrence of the word in a book where Translator's Notes will give the most detailed explanation of that term. So you can do a find in Paratext, for instance, in the book of Luke on the word sin, and you'll see it occurs first in chapter 1, verse 77. So then if you look at that in Translator's Notes, you will see an entry on sins. This is very helpful, so I'm going to read this one. The word sins refers to offenses against God or another person. Sins include acts, thoughts, and attitudes that are not what God wants or approves. A person can also offend God by not doing what God wants him to do. Try to translate sins with a general term that can include any wrongdoing against God. Here are some problems to avoid. The term should not imply that only serious crimes like murder or stealing are sins. Other offenses like gossip and greed are also sins. And the term should not include accidents or mistakes that are not against God's will. So some ways to translate sin are wrong acts, or offenses against God, or evil deeds. In some languages, it may be natural to translate sins with a phrase that includes a verb. For example, wrong things that they have done. So this gives us some good insight about the meaning of this key term. We started doing research by coming up with questions needing research before we could start translating Luke 11, 1-4. So that was the first part of our task, and we were halfway there. And now, through careful study, using various translation reference tools, we found answers to our questions. During this workshop, we'll be translating the Good Samaritan story. and you've had an exercise in which you've identified questions needing further research for that passage. Now it's time for you to find answers to the questions you identified in that passage. But first, I would like to review how we do step 1 of translation, doing the exegesis. The procedures on the next 7 slides come from a book by Gordon Fee called New Testament Exegesis, and they have been translated into Nepali and are available as a handout. We want to start by looking at the whole book, getting the big picture. So first, we need to examine the historical situation. Who is the author? Who are the recipients? What is the relationship between them? And what historical situation gave rise to the message? Why did the author write? Now, these things you'll often find by reading a book introduction. Next, make an overview of the whole document. Read the text through in different versions. One should be a literal version, the other should be a meaning-based version. Discover the author's purpose and the recurring themes. Identify the major units of the book. Familiarize yourself with the structure of the book. For instance, divisions, sections, paragraphs. Study the structure of the book. Make a map or an outline, or study the outline found in the book introduction. What signals are there of boundaries and of internal unity? So after looking at the big picture, next we want to look at a section and focus in on the details. So look at the section in its context. How does this section relate to what comes before and what comes after? What is the main theme of the passage? What marks it as a unit? Read the section in 2 or 3 different versions. Choose one version that's more literal. That is, it follows the structure of the original language text more closely. Choose one that is more meaning-based. That is, it aims to communicate the meaning as effectively as possible. It's good to use versions in different languages. In reviewing these procedures, I think we're seeing that much of what we have been teaching is very similar to this book on New Testament exegesis. 6, he says to ask the right questions. List points to be investigated and potential problems. Are there unknown ideas? Are there symbolic actions? Are there cross-cultural differences? Are there idioms or figures of speech? Are there difficult grammatical constructions to unravel? Are there abstract nouns expressing event ideas that might be better expressed as verbs? Are there any ambiguities or unclear meanings? Are there any of constructions, ellipses, passives, and others? Understanding these kinds of things will help us to understand the meaning of the source text. So note any textual problems, alternative interpretations, or unclear meanings. Identify key words that need in-depth study. Establish the text. Are there any textual problems in the passage? That is, are any of the source translations following different Greek manuscripts? So these are the different kinds of questions we can ask in order to find the meaning of the source text. Point 9, find the facts. Use reference helps. Bible versions in different languages, study Bibles, dictionaries, commentaries, articles, translators' notes, translators' handbooks, exegetical summaries. Study other passages that may be relevant, especially parallel passages. Make decisions on alternative interpretations. Which are you going to follow in your translation? Think or talk through the whole passage. Realize how everything connects together. Review the relationship between the different parts. Prepare to translate. In the next class session, in language groups, I'd like you to use research tools to find the answers to the questions you had for Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. Remember, look at various versions and back translations if they're available. Use translation reference tools. I think you've seen in this presentation how valuable and useful Translator's Notes and Translator's Handbook are in finding the meaning of the source text and different ways to translate that into your language. Use dictionaries, Bible dictionaries, commentaries, and even Google. After you have thoroughly studied the meaning of the passage, you are then ready to re-express the meaning in the target language. You are ready to move from step 1, doing the exegesis, to step 2, making the first draft. So here once again are our 10 steps in order to produce a good quality translation. First, we need to do the exegesis to understand the source text, and then we make the first draft into our languages. So that is the end of our teaching about exegesis. To be honest, I feel that many teams often don't give enough emphasis to this first very important step of translation. Perhaps they feel they already know what the text means, or they don't want to take the time to do it, and they just go directly to the verse and start translating verse by verse. But I would encourage you to use the different versions available and to compare them and to look in the translation reference tools available to you to make sure that you really understand the meaning before you translate. May God help us all to produce good quality translations of His holy word. See you next time. Bye. If you are taking this training as part of a translation workshop, you'll see in the green box on the workshop schedule that we've just finished our third presentation on exegesis, finding answers. It would be good for your instructor to look together with you the compiled questions that you had for the Good Samaritan story. In the next class period, in the red box, you will have time to work in your language teams using reference materials to find answers to the questions raised. And then we'll come back for our next teaching time to look at drafting, making a first draft and keyboarding the text. That is step 2 in the 10 steps of translation.